Ethan was the kind of person who always looked at the stars and believed he could touch them. From a young age, he was curious. He loved to take apart radios, old clocks, and kitchen blenders just to see how they worked. While other kids played outside, Ethan was busy building odd-looking machines in his garage. He wasn't always sure what they did, but to him, it didn't matter. He was exploring, dreaming. He wasn't a genius, not the smartest kid in class, but he had something special, passion. When he talked about inventing, his eyes lit up. He believed that one day he would create something that could help people, something the world had never seen. As he grew older, his dream didn't fade, it grew louder. He began studying science more seriously. He saved his allowance for parts. He stayed up late reading books on engineering and design. While his friends talked about parties and video games, Ethan was sketching ideas and trying to figure out how he could make the world better, one invention at a time. Then came the opportunity of a lifetime, a national invention competition. Ethan was thrilled. This was his chance to show the world what he could do. He worked day and night on a new invention, a smart farming tool. It wasn't fancy or high-tech, but it was practical. It was designed for small farmers, the kind who struggled to make ends meet. His invention could measure soil moisture, give planting advice, and even help track the weather. Ethan believed it could change lives. The weeks before the competition were intense. He barely slept. He revised, rebuilt, and tested everything over and over. When the day finally came to present it, Ethan walked into the hall with his prototype in his hands and hope in his heart. He looked around and saw competitors with glossy presentations, complex robotics, and expensive gear. Still, he believed in his idea. He believed that his purpose was bigger than the technology around him. But when the results came, Ethan's name wasn't called. Not for runner-up, not for honorable mention, not for anything. One of the judges approached him later and said, "Your idea is sweet, but it's too simple. It's not what we're looking for at this level." Those words hit Ethan like a brick. He tried to smile, but his heart was sinking. The ride home was quiet. He didn't speak. His mind was racing with doubt. Did I waste my time? Am I really good enough? Was I just fooling myself? That night, he placed his invention on a shelf and closed his notebook. He didn't eat. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He felt like the dream he had carried since childhood had just been crushed. It wasn't just about losing a competition. It was the feeling that he wasn't good enough, that maybe he never would be. Failure has a way of being loud, of telling us we're done before we've even truly begun. And in that moment, for Ethan, failure felt final, but it wasn't. It was only the first step, and everything was about to change. Ethan didn't talk to anyone for days. The invention he once held with so much pride now sat quietly on a shelf collecting dust. He didn't even want to look at it. Every time he did, it reminded him of failure, of not being good enough, of not being seen. He stayed in his room, curtains closed, not answering messages from friends or classmates. He even ignored calls from his teacher who had encouraged him to join the competition in the first place. The disappointment had settled deep inside him. He questioned everything, his talent, his dream, his entire path. What hurt the most wasn't just the loss, it was the silence that followed. No applause, no feedback, no recognition, just silence. Ethan felt small. He had worked so hard for so long, and in just one moment, it all seemed to disappear. His parents tried to comfort him, but nothing they said reached him. Until one evening, as the sky outside turned orange and gold, his grandfather came to visit. Ethan's grandfather, Mr. James, was an old man with wise eyes and a slow, steady voice. He had lived through wars, hard times, and more failures than Ethan could imagine. He walked into Ethan's room, sat beside him, and said nothing for a while. He just looked at the invention on the shelf. Then, in a calm voice, he spoke. "You know, Ethan," he said, "when I was your age, I wanted to be a painter." Ethan glanced up surprised. He never knew that. "I painted every day," Mr. James continued, "entered my first exhibition with hope in my heart. Do you know what the judges said? That my work looked like a child's drawing." Ethan stayed quiet, but I kept painting, not because I thought I'd win, but because I loved it. And every time I failed, I learned. And every time I learned, I grew. That's how life works. He turned to Ethan and looked him in the eyes. Every great story, he said, starts with a failure. What you do next, that's what makes you who you are. Those words sank deep. For the first time in days, Ethan felt something shift. Maybe failure wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about his grandfather's words. He sat up, turned on the light, and picked up his old notebook, the one he hadn't opened since the competition. He flipped through the pages, looking at his sketches, his notes, his wild ideas. Then he opened a new page, grabbed a pencil, and began to draw. He didn't know where it would lead, but this time, he wasn't creating for a prize. He wasn't building to impress anyone. He was doing it for himself because he loved it, because even though he had failed once, he realized something powerful. He could still try again. Failure had broken his confidence, but it hadn't taken his dream. And now, step by step, pencil stroke by pencil stroke, he was taking it back. Ethan began again, not with confidence, but with curiosity. Each night, after finishing his schoolwork, he would sit by the same window, notebook open, lamp glowing softly, and start to sketch new ideas. There was no pressure, no judges, no scoreboard, just him, a pencil, and a dream that refused to die. He didn't talk much about it, not even to his friends. This time, it was personal. One evening, while researching how farmers in rural areas were adapting to climate change, Ethan found an online video from a village in Southeast Asia. Farmers were struggling with unpredictable weather, poor soil, and a lack of access to modern tools. Watching that video, something inside him clicked. He remembered why he started in the first place. It wasn't about winning competitions or gaining recognition. It was about helping people. So he began redesigning his invention. This time, he made it simpler, cheaper, and solar-powered. He focused on what mattered, making it easy to use, even in places without electricity or internet. It didn't need to look high-tech, it needed to work. He even added a feature that could record daily weather patterns using basic sensors so farmers could better plan their planting schedules. Night after night, he made improvements. And slowly, the invention transformed into something new, something powerful. But one big problem remained. He didn't have enough money to build a working prototype. Instead of giving up, Ethan thought differently. He created a short video explaining the invention, what it did, and who it was for. He uploaded it online and started a small crowdfunding campaign. At first, only a few friends and family members donated. Then a local farmers group shared the video. Then a teacher in another state. Then a farming blog. Within a month, Ethan had enough funds to build 3 prototypes. He didn't wait. He built them himself with help from a retired engineer his grandfather knew. They spent weekends in a tiny garage, testing, fixing, laughing, and learning. It wasn't perfect. Some parts failed. The sensors glitched. One prototype even broke entirely. But this time, failure didn't break Ethan, it built him. With every setback, he adapted. With every mistake, he adjusted, and slowly, the invention began to work. He reached out to a small farm school in a nearby rural area and asked if they'd be willing to test his device. They agreed. When Ethan visited, he met young students and farmers eager to try anything that could make their work easier. He explained how the invention worked. They listened carefully. Then they used it in the field. A week later, they called Ethan with feedback. "It's helping," the teacher said. "We're actually seeing changes." For the first time, Ethan felt something more powerful than pride. He felt purpose. He had failed once in front of a crowd, but now, in silence, in small steps, he was making a real impact. And that was success, pure, quiet, and deeply meaningful. Ethan realized something important. Motivation might get you started, but only discipline keeps you going. He had rebuilt not just his invention, but himself. And the journey was far from over. Ethan stood quietly at the edge of the field, watching the device he had built being used by people who needed it most. It wasn't a grand stage. There were no flashing lights or microphones, no trophies. Just rows of crops, smiling students, and a teacher giving instructions while holding his invention like it was something special. That moment, simple and real, was more powerful than any award ceremony he could imagine. He didn't need applause anymore. He had found something better, proof that his ideas could help real people in the real world. As weeks passed, Ethan stayed in touch with the school. The farmer sent him updates. They shared photos, handwritten notes, and even suggestions on how to improve the invention. Ethan took every message seriously. He wasn't just a creator now, he had become a listener. He understood something profound. Success isn't just about building something great, it's about learning from the people you serve. It's about staying open even after failure, especially after failure. Ethan's story began to slowly spread beyond his town. A local news channel picked up his journey. They ran a short feature called The Boy Who Failed Forward. People loved it. Soon, Ethan was invited to speak at a youth technology event. At first, he hesitated. He still remembered how nervous he was at his first presentation, the one that ended in silence and rejection. But this time, things felt different. He had nothing to prove. He had something to share. So he stepped on stage, not as someone trying to impress, but as someone ready to tell the truth. He told the audience about the failure, the disappointment, the nights of doubt, and how he chose to rise anyway. He spoke from the heart. No perfect script, no polished speech, just honesty. And when he finished, there was silence again, but not the cold kind. This time, it was the kind that happens when people are truly listening. Then came the applause, long, genuine, and full of respect. After the event, students lined up to speak to him. Some shared their own failures. Others asked how to keep going when nothing seemed to work. Ethan smiled and said what his grandfather once told him. Every great story starts with a failure. What you do next, that's what makes the difference. From that day on, Ethan began mentoring younger students in his school. He helped them turn ideas into projects and taught them that failure wasn't something to fear, it was something to study, learn from, and rise beyond. He even organized a small failure fair where students showcased projects that didn't work but explained what they learned. Laughter filled the room. It was open, honest, safe. Something had shifted in the culture around them. People stopped hiding their failures. They started embracing them because Ethan had shown them that failure was never the opposite of success. It was the first step toward it. And with each small victory, each person inspired, Ethan's journey came full circle, not because he reached the top, but because he learned how to rise every time he fell. Years passed. Ethan wasn't a teenager anymore. He had grown into a thoughtful young man with worn-out notebooks, quiet confidence, and a reputation for helping others turn failure into growth. One afternoon, he received an email from an international innovation summit. They had heard about his story and invited him to present his invention and share his journey with people from around the world. The invitation felt surreal. He had once been the boy who stood on stage and froze. Now he was being asked to speak because of that failure and what he did after. When Ethan arrived at the event, he felt the nervousness again, but it wasn't fear this time, it was energy. He looked around at inventors, leaders, and dreamers from every corner of the globe. Some wore suits, some wore sandals. All of them were there because they believed in ideas that could make the world better, and so did he. When he stepped on stage, he carried more than just a presentation. He carried years of learning, rebuilding, and rising. He stood there, looked out at the audience, and began with the words that had become his truth. My biggest success began with my biggest failure. He shared how he failed publicly, how he cried, how he nearly gave up, and then how one moment of reflection, one conversation with his grandfather changed everything. He spoke about the long nights, the failed prototypes, the small victories, the farmers who believed in him, the students he mentored, the failure fair at his school, and the power of choosing discipline over motivation when motivation ran out. The audience was silent, but this silence was golden, like the sunrise before a new beginning. After the presentation, people came up to him, not just to praise him, but to thank him. They shared their own failures, their own stumbles, their own moments of wanting to quit. And Ethan listened, because that's what real success does. It listens, it lifts, it serves. Before he left, a young girl from another country approached him, holding a sketchbook in her hand. She looked up and said, "I thought I was the only one who failed like that. But now I know I'm just getting started." Ethan smiled and nodded. "You're exactly where you need to be," he said. Later that night, he walked outside, looked up at the stars, and thought about how far he had come, not just in distance, but in growth. He wasn't the same boy who once needed approval to feel worthy. Now he knew who he was. He had failed, learned, built, grown, and more importantly, he had helped others do the same. Because in the end, success wasn't about applause, recognition, or awards. It was about rising after the fall and bringing others with you when you rise. Ethan's journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Because once you understand that failure is not the end, but the doorway to greatness, you realize something powerful. You don't have to fear failure anymore. You just have to keep walking through it, step by step, day by day, until your story becomes the reason someone else doesn't give up.